what are the 5 precepts of Buddhism and how do they develop and why should we practice them? I'll be discussing that on today's video. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can find courses about the early Buddhist Dharma. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So in today's video, we're going to discuss the 5 precepts. What are they? Now, to begin with, I think a lot of us may want to know how these developed and want to know, understand the ways that Buddhism changed from its earliest recognizable form into the form that we practice nowadays. Not necessarily that we're going to say one or the other is better. It may be for us or it may not, but at least just for curiosity's sake and because it can at least, to an extent, inform our practice to see that there are other ways of interpreting these things. So what we're going to do in this video is to look back a bit about the 5 precepts and how they seem to have originated. Nowadays, they're taken almost as sort of 5 Buddhist commandments, almost as though they were given to us by some deified Buddha or a god or something. I mean, I'm not saying everyone interprets them that way, but they're almost seen that way, as sort of these 5, that they're extremely important to understand and know and keep in mind. Now, to begin with, what are the 5? Before we go any farther, they're relatively straightforward. We might almost say secular in their impact. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit sexual misconduct, don't lie, and don't abuse alcohol or intoxicants. Those are the 5. They're very simple and straightforward. They're the kinds of things that many of us will understand, make perfect sense. And these 5 are often used if we decide to ordain or become a Buddhist in some formal sense as a layperson. We may have to recite them. They're regularly recited in, let's say, Theravada centers, even in Pali, which is the language that we find them in, the ancient language from India that we find them in. However, when we look to the source of the chant that's generally given in Pali, we find, at least as far as I can tell, that it comes from a commentary to a very late canonical text called the Khuddaka, and so it's not, we don't find the things that we chant, or that many of us may chant, we don't find it in the earliest texts. Instead, we find a range of different possibilities, and this is what we're going to look at today. To be clear, while all of the 5 precepts are indeed found in the early texts, they're rarely found as a list of simply 5. And so this idea that many of us may have, that these are sort of the 5 lay commandments of Buddhism, is not something that we find if we look back at the suttas, let's say, the suttas that are found in early Buddhism. Now, why do I call these the 5 commandments of lay Buddhism, or the 5 what appear to be the commandments of lay Buddhism? Because they really reflect only upon lay practice. Monastics have different groups of precepts or laws that they have to abide by. These are the laws that are found in the Vinaya, which is the book of Buddhist law. And there are indeed a very, very long list of such laws for monastics, over 100 as I recall, maybe even a couple of hundred. So they're much, much more complicated. And indeed, of these 5, one of them is quite different, whereas for a layperson we say to avoid sexual misconduct. For a monastic, it's to avoid sex altogether. It's to remain celibate. So there's that difference as well. And indeed, we also find that on certain days, which are called UPOSATHA days in traditional practice, lay people will take 8 precepts, where we take 4 of the 5 that we've already mentioned, plus for that day, there is the layperson is to remain celibate. They're also to avoid singing and dancing. They're to avoid high beds. higher luxurious beds, and they're to avoid eating after noon, which is, all of these are ways that the layperson can, for a day, sort of understand what it is to live a monastic life. So they're sort of getting monastic life for a day, if you like. I mean, it's sort of almost like that. They're not quite, but it's at least an attempt along those lines. So this is another way that the 5 precepts aren't exactly sort of a 5 commandments, because it changes. If we're a traditional believer, it may change from day to day. In any event, when we look at the suttas, we find a number of different discussions of practices that are around what we might term the 5 precepts, and I'll go through a few of these here. In one sutta, we find 8 practices that the Buddha says will lead to a happier life and a better rebirth. And these include taking the 3 refuges, that is the refuge in the Buddha, the refuge in the Dharma, and the refuge in the Sangha being the group of monastics and well-practicing lay people. That is the first 3 of this 8, and the other 5 the Buddha describes as long-standing, traditional, and ancient gifts. Now he describes these as gifts because they give the gift of freedom from fear and worry to other people around us. These are, of course, the 5 precepts that we're discussing here, but they're described as gifts, and they're described as long-standing and ancient, which perhaps means that these 5 precepts were around in the Buddha's day, that he did not come up with them. Indeed, we find similar kinds of precepts in other views, such as Jainism of the day, which Jainism is a different religion that preceded Buddhism. In another early sutta, the Buddha discusses moral and immoral conduct with a number of lay people from Sala. And in this sutta, the Buddha discusses 10 practices. He discusses 3 practices by way of body, 4 by way of speech, and 3 by way of mind. The practice by way of body is not to kill, not to steal, and not to commit sexual misconduct. The practice by way of speech is not to lie, which we already have heard, but also to avoid divisive speech, to avoid harsh speech, and to avoid idle chatter or gossip, if you like. And the 3 by way of mind are to avoid covetousness, that is to say, coveting other people's belongings, to be kind-hearted, and to have right view. Now, what we see is a much broader scope of practice than simply the 5 precepts. Indeed, there are differences here. Many of us who are familiar with the Eightfold Path will see a lot of resonances here with that path. The 3 practices by way of body are sort of like right action. The 4 by way of speech are sort of like right speech. And the 3 by way of mind are sort of like right intention and right view. So this is kind of a retelling of the Eightfold Path to these lay people of Sala as providing them 10 practices that they can take into their lives. And this, I think, demonstrates the way that the Buddha shook things up and put things around and didn't always stick to the same lists of 5 or 8 or whatever. He changed depending on the audience. Now, the next question we may have is why to practice either these 5 precepts or these 10 practices, whatever it might be. Why should we do these things? And in another sutta, the Buddha gives an answer to that question. What he says is, if someone were to do this thing to me, I wouldn't like it. But if I were to do it to them, they wouldn't like it either. The thing that is disliked by me is also disliked by another. Since I dislike this thing, how can I inflict it on another? And in this sutta, I've put in brackets because the Buddha discusses the 3 bodily behaviors and 4 verbal behaviors that we've already heard about just before. So in this other sutta, he's going through all of these bodily and verbal behaviors and basically using the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or don't do unto others as you wouldn't have them do unto you, if you like. Going through them all that way. And it's this kind of method that the Buddha uses here to say that we should avoid hurting other people. We should avoid injury. We should avoid harm. But it's more than just that, because the Buddha talks about purifying ourselves in 3 ways. First, he says we can purify ourselves by, as I say, avoiding the behavior. Second, he says we can purify ourselves by encouraging others to avoid that behavior. And third, we can purify ourselves by praising people who have avoided this behavior. So in that sense, we're doing more than simply avoiding. We're also speaking out. We're encouraging people. We're praising people. We're doing quite a bit more in our practice than simply the avoidance of certain things. So this, again, suggests a broader kind of practice for both lay people and monastics. Now, we should note, I think, here that in a number of these recent discussions of different moral trainings that we can undertake or different moral practices, there wasn't a mention of the 5th precept of avoiding intoxicants. This may be because that precept was added later, that it wasn't there originally, or it may be simply that that precept isn't found in many texts because it was considered of somewhat secondary importance. It doesn't appear, for example, in the Eightfold Path or in the description of the practices of the Eightfold Path. And this is perhaps, again, because the problem with intoxicants is that they make it more likely that you will violate right speech or right action, these kinds of other practices we've discussed, rather than that alcohol is necessarily a problem on its own. But when we look back on these various descriptions of practice, of ethical practice, what we see is a broad constellation of different options, including different kinds of practices for lay people on different days, including different practices for lay people and for monastics, including suggestions that we not only follow the precepts, but also that we take the refuges, that we encourage other people to do the same, that we praise things a certain way. There's a large range of things to do. It's not simply 5 precepts if we look at these early texts. But while the Buddha doesn't often discuss 5 precepts in the early texts, we do so nowadays. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes it simpler and easier for us to understand and remember. Nevertheless, it has a potential downside, which is that we begin to think of these as special commandments, that the Buddha laid down these 5 things and that we have to sort of grasp onto them and remember them and hold on to them for dear life, as it were. And that can lead to the problem of clinging to rituals, to rules and rituals, which I discussed in a prior video. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page. It's linked down below, and helping out the channel and getting something in return for your time. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video.